Welcome back, WNST, Tassel Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively into the first bye week of the season. It's a Labor Day week. There's no football, but there's plenty of football news and cuts and speculation here to end all of that, or at least begin some of it for next week as we go to Las Vegas and wager on all things football, because we have partnership now with Bet. Luke Jones joins us now. He is Baltimore Luke. You can find him out on Twitter and Facebook, and of course at Baltimore Positive, and usually out on the backfields of Owings Mills. The Turk came a-calling here this week, Luke, and some names came, and my wife, we were at the Alanis Morissette concert down in Merriweather. My wife said, "Oh my God, they're cutting guys. They cut Pernell McPhee. How did they do that?" And I'm like, hold on, let me get Luke on the show. Let's figure out what's really going on here. So go ahead, Luke.
Well, I think that's the big key, and I use this term a lot. You can deliberately see it in my headlines at BaltimorePositive.com, the initial 53-man roster. And this has always applied. I mean, you can go back to 1996, 97. You know, you're signing guys off the practice squad, you're claiming guys off the waiver wire and telling someone that made the team initially and said, sorry, we just waived you, and we're hoping to get you on the practice squad because, well, we found someone better on the waiver wire that we like. So there's always that, but especially in this era of still being in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the rules that were put in place last year, in part because of the new CBA, this wasn't all COVID, but also then in response to playing football in the midst of the pandemic, you have an expanded practice squad, you have the ability, and this was actually just part of the CBA, where you can elevate a couple players from the practice squad for each game. So you have that from a roster flexibility standpoint. And I think the big one, and this is where it really showed up on Tuesday when the Ravens made their final cuts, and as you mentioned, Pernell McPhee, Anthony Levine. I think you could possibly even put Justin Ellis into that category. We're going to have to see how it shakes out here over the next couple of days. These are moving targets, and you're talking about what I'm talking about here is injured reserve with the designation to return. Way back when, we can remember Ray Lewis in 2012. Back then, you had to make a designation at the time a player was hurt, and you had one for the entire season. Now, in part because of COVID, and also because teams just like it, and it gives them more roster flexibility. And I think the NFLPA is fine with it as well, because of it, there's no real downside for them. But you can now bring back, and we saw this last year, as many guys as you want from injured reserve after only a 3-week minimum, whereas before it had been 8 weeks or 8 games. However, the catch here, because you don't want teams just stashing every player they have any little morsel of interest in, is they must be on the initial 53-man roster. So what does that mean? If you look at the Ravens' current roster right now, Rashad Bateman, we think he's going to IR with the designation to return. We know he's not going to be ready for week 1. Weeks ago, they said sometime in September. When John Harbaugh says that, my money's on October then. So if that's the case, he goes to IR. He's out for the first 3 games. He continues to rehab, and you hope he's back for October. You also have Miles Boykin, who hasn't practiced since the first week of camp with a hamstring injury. Many people thought he was on the bubble anyway, but when you consider where the Ravens are at wide receiver, with Bateman hurt, Sammy Watkins and his injury history, Marquise Brown with an injury history, you want to reserve, you want some reinforcements potentially for later in the season. And I get it. Miles Boykin hasn't developed in the way that the Ravens would have hoped over his first couple of years, but he can play special teams and he can block. So if you have a run of injuries later in the season, Miles Boykin makes a lot more sense at that point. So why wouldn't you stash him? So I anticipate him going to IR. Jimmy Smith is another possibility, as he's missed the better part of the last 4 weeks with an ankle injury that ended up being a little worse than they originally thought. So what does that mean? If we're talking about those 3 guys, and I'm not guaranteeing all 3 go to IR, but if they do, and you want to have them back, they must be on the 53-man roster. So what does that mean? Well, 3 other guys who are going to be on your team, at least in the interim, are not going to have spots for that first 24 hours. So who are you looking to? Well, clearly you're not looking at guys with multi-year contracts because there's cap ramifications for that. You're not looking for guys that are subject to waivers because, well, they can be claimed by someone else. So you're looking at vested veterans on 1-year contracts. And who fits that description? Pernell McPhee, Anthony Levine, Justin Ellis. And you could even throw Eric Tomlinson in there, even with Nick Boyle knowing he's not going to be ready for week one. Although Tomlinson, I could see just going to the practice squad and being elevated.
There's a lot of not ready for week one, right? You know what I mean? To just week one's here. It's week one. And I know we'll spend a lot of time talking about this next week, but there are some familiar bodies that are not going to be on the field next Monday night. I mean, just period. And I don't think most of us sort of have come to grips with any of that because I don't think most people have watched this trash the last month. I mean, honestly, most of the people that are big fans have started to really wean off of watching this or trying to piece it together the way you do. They just rely on you and Jeff Zrebeck and the people that go out there and sweat to figure it out. Even figuring out the guy's numbers are weird because Patrick Queen hasn't been on the field a whole lot to figure out what a single-digit guy looks like because they haven't played a whole lot. So it is a little bit of a scramble in that way. But when you say things like, well, Boyle won't be ready, and we haven't seen much of Stanley, and, well, you know, Zeitler wasn't this, and Hollywood Brown isn't that, and the kid they drafted, he's not a and Dobbins, he's got an AC. Who's around? You know what I mean? Oh, we spend the whole summer talking about everybody getting hurt.
Sure. I mean, I think people follow it. I mean, maybe they're not engaged in the third or fourth quarter of these preseason games, but people are following it. People are plugged in enough to know that, yeah, Rashad Bateman had groin surgery 3 weeks ago, and he's not going to be ready for the start of the season. We've known Nick Boyle had the serious knee injury back, it was that Sunday night game in the rain in New England and had the cleanup procedure back in June, which kind of delayed his return to practice. So John Harbaugh said earlier in the week that he's not going to be ready for week one. So, but they did not put him on the PUP list. So that tells you they expect him to be back before week 7, right? PUP, you missed the first 6 weeks of the season. So that's a pretty wide range there, but at least you have an idea there that they didn't just put him on the reserve PUP list, which would take him out of play until week 7. So, but there are going to be some guys. And as I mentioned, Jimmy Smith is, up in the air for week 1, week 2. That's why he could be a short-term IR candidate. And as I mentioned, Miles Boykin, I think Boykin's probably a little more of a stash situation in the sense that I could see them not rushing to get him back because they already have all these wide receivers and he didn't practice all summer. I think he's more of a what-if kind of guy right now in the way that Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter stashed guys at AAA years ago. I mean, that's what that feels a little more like to me. But my point is, in order to do those short-term IRs, they have to be on the 53-man rosters. So you have to go to, and we remember this famously with Justin Forsett 5 years ago. You go to a veteran who's on a short-term deal. There aren't major cap ramifications because you don't want to cut a guy and have a bunch of dead money on your salary cap. But you go to them and say, hey, we want to get this guy and this guy on the injured reserve, but be able to bring them back. They have to be on the 53 right now. Can we work something out with you? Because you're a vested vet, you don't have to go through waivers. You can sign with anyone immediately. And look, if someone calls you and blows you away with a huge offer, then that's our loss. But if that doesn't happen, can we put this guy on IR, put him on the roster and then put him on IR? And
I'm thinking the Chiefs signed Terrell Suggs for a week once.
Oh,
gave him a ring.
I mean, it can happen. Well, and this is where you do run the risk. Look, do I think anyone's going to go out there and sign Anthony Levine? No, I don't. I think Anthony Levine has more value to the Ravens at this point than any other team. He's a special teams guy and very limited defensive value. Pernell McPhee, maybe. There's always that possibility. I mean, there was that possibility, and John Harbaugh, I remember him asking this, and I want to say maybe I even asked the question. I don't remember exactly, but he acknowledged, yeah, when you're doing this, you have to do this with the conviction to know that there's a non-zero chance that guy could get plucked by someone else with a better contract offer, and then you're out of luck. So that's why you don't say, well, Pernell McPhee's definitely going to be back. Anthony Levine's definitely going to be back. Justin Ellis is definitely going to be back, but
they'd like them to be back. The expectation is, right?
Yeah, and they have this conversation. And look, as I wrote in my 12 Ravens thoughts at BaltimorePositive.com, if you can't work out a handshake agreement with Pernell McPhee and Anthony Levine, two guys who've spent most of their respective careers in Baltimore and, won a Super Bowl here in Baltimore, then who can you work a handshake agreement out with? So I think you're going to see at least some of these guys that I just mentioned back at some point, either late in the week or, in the days leading up to the season opener. Now, I'll say this, and I mentioned this also going back to the Justin Forsett that precedent 5 years ago. Keep in mind, Justin Forsett got cut after week 4 that year. So when you are doing something like this with a player, it is a reflection on some recognition that this isn't a guy that we feel is an absolute critical must-have. Can't lose this guy under any circumstances, because if that were the case, you wouldn't risk doing this.
It's like when you leave him unprotected in the expansion draft.
No
right?
question. Right. Exactly. There are certain guys in an expansion draft that probably aren't going to be picked up by anyone else, but you have to fulfill.
You also don't want to hurt their feelings either.
Right.
There's that.
Exactly. So there's some of that.
Can't leave Cal Ripken unprotected. You know what I mean?
Right. But there is some of that, and that's why you have to have a conversation, and that's why veterans who have a trust in the organization are going to be more, they're going to oblige and be more agreeable with something like this compared to someone who just came in on a 1-year deal and doesn't know you as well. If you tried to do this with Justin Houston, he probably would have said, "Kick rocks! What are you guys talking about? You just brought me in
you don't know
in early August." Right. So that's what we're talking about here. Beyond that, there weren't a ton of big surprises. I mean, Trace McSorley, I think. Me, I've long been an advocate of only keeping 2 quarterbacks on the 53-man roster, but Lamar Jackson's vaccination status or lack thereof certainly brings up, an urgency to have a more viable third quarterback on the practice squad. So whether it's McSorley, which I think there's a good chance it ends up being Trace getting back onto the practice squad, or it could be a Josh Johnson who was just waived by the Jets, was with the Ravens in the preseason. I think it was 2016. Mobile guy, older guy, would be a perfect candidate to have for a third quarterback on the practice squad, which, keep in mind, the practice squad, I mentioned the elevations, but also expanded once again, 16 guys on the practice squad. You can have veteran guys, there's no limits like there were in previous years. So lots of roster flexibility. And let's face it, when you have a general manager who over the weekend traded an offensive lineman who had no shot, was not on the bubble whatsoever, Greg Mance, and a 7th-round pick to the Miami Dolphins to get a 6th-round pick, probably a general manager who's going to take advantage of some of these loopholes and more flexible roster rules.
Well, these trades, let's talk about that for a minute, because these trades, they don't sound like anything, and they sound like throwaway third-day picks. That's the juice that you call up in the second round when you want to move up 15 spots. That's the thing that allows you to deal with the Chiefs or the Packers to get the linebacker you want next year with pick 56 instead of sitting on the clock waiting for pick 81 or whatever. And it's intricate, and it's very Vedvig-y, and it's very, we fleeced Belichick with a kid we didn't want. But this is kind of like squirreling up nuts to, have next year. And this is really the strength of Eric in the organization and the analytic part of him and Ozzie having this thing for 25 years. They're just little Coons Ford text you send our way, right? But, once April comes around and you have that much draft capital, you don't want to say we're going to draft 14 or 15 players. You're not. You're going to draft 8 or 9 better players.
Right. Each of these moves in isolation don't mean a whole lot. I mean, like I said, you trade an offensive lineman who wasn't going to make the team, and Greg Mance, a guy they had picked up in the offseason, and a 7th-round pick that you had just picked up in the Wade deal, and then you get a 6th-round pick. Well, look, you and I can rattle off the 6th-round picks that have made a major impact in Baltimore. There aren't many. There have been some, so that's why. But chances are that 6th-round pick by itself isn't going to net a whole lot. But it's the aggregate. It's the long term. It's the collection. It's the sum of the parts here that helps you. That's why you look at a deal like they made on cut down day. They send Ben Bredesen. They send their 5th-round pick that they acquired in the Orlando Brown trade, and they send a 7th-round pick in 2023, which can't get more worthless than what that pick in isolation. And what did you get? You got a 4th-round pick from the Giants next year. Now, Ben Bredesen wasn't going to make this team. There's certainly an argument to be made that, hey, you did draft this guy in the 4th round last year. You had a need at guard. You'd like him to show a little more than he did. So you could look at that pick and say, yeah, that wasn't a very good pick. But the difference is And all these teams are going to have those picks. I mean, the Ravens have had plenty of duds that they've drafted. I mean, no one bats 1,000. No one bats even close to 1,000.
Which is really an unbelievable thing,
best,
considering how much tape they have, how much time, resource,
HR
put into it, that more of the guys don't pan out to make them happy that they're, but I mean, the same thing would be done in any hiring process. Anybody that's ever hired people would say, every time I hire someone, I think they're the perfect candidate until they start working, and 2 weeks in, you start to figure out they weren't perfect. They might be a 7 or an 8. You're very happy if they're a 9, but if they're a 5 or 6, you have to start thinking like, I got to replace them. And it's amazing how quickly that happens on this curve where they draft a kid in April that they spent 6 months salivating about. They were happy to have in the building, and after 90 days, they're like, well, let's go play for the Jaguars, or maybe Belichick wants you, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you just said it. Human beings are imperfect. So, I mean, the human element, there's the, it's not as though college football standardized where everyone's playing the same, a similar schedule as far as quality of opponents. So, yeah, I mean, I think the lesson here, though, is not that the Ravens failed on some picks, which, again, Ben Bredesen, a 4th-round guard, you'd like to see more than they got from him. I mean, that was pretty evident early last year that he wasn't in the mix last year, and he certainly wasn't in the mix at left guard this year. So that aside, what you like here is not falling victim to the sunk cost fallacy of, oh my goodness, we can't give up on a 4th-round pick just yet. Well, if you have plenty of evidence to suggest the guy can't play, and you have an opportunity here to essentially get a draft mulligan that you'll get a 4th-round pick next year for him.
The Ravens didn't love Illuminor, right? I mean, on all of these guys that they trade, that they get anything for, it really is amazing. It means somebody else values them long after they decided they don't value them anymore, right?
Right. But I think what we're starting to see, and this feels like an Eric DaCosta thing, this feels like a recent analytics-minded thing that we're seeing more and more of, is not holding on to these picks for 3 years. In the case of Shaun Wade, their secondary is really deep. But as we said this in a previous conversation, if the Ravens liked what they saw with Shaun Wade, they weren't going to trade him. They weren't going to trade him. Certainly weren't going to trade him to the Patriots. So they clearly didn't like what they saw, but they thought, okay, instead of holding on to this guy for another year or stashing him on IR, let's see if there's a team that liked him in the pre-draft process and it to a similar degree that we did, and see if we can recoup our 5th-round pick. And that's essentially what they did. Now, it's 2 years down the road, and certainly there are theories out there that if you push picks into further years out, then the value diminishes in the way that you kind of think of like an annuity with the lottery or something like that. But you basically get a long-term mulligan, and the Ravens were able to do that with Bredesen, with sending him in a 5th-rounder and a throwaway 7th-rounder in 2023 to get a 4th-round pick next year. So it's about collecting assets. It's about assigning value to players, and that's always a moving target, right? At some point in time, the Ravens were over the moon to get Rashad Perriman, and we know how that turned out. They were over the moon to sign Earl Thomas. We know how that turned out. They've been over the moon
about every wide receiver the last 6 years, thinking that this was going to be the guy. Right. They were over the moon about Miles Boykin for 5 minutes in the preseason a couple of years. I mean, they've been searching for that answer for a long time. They were over the moon to draft the tight end that they got rid of instantly because they found a better tight end.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's the way this thing works. And again, when you're talking about a 4th-round pick, a 5th-round pick, these are relatively early day 3 picks. Eric would be the first to say, we need to do a better job with those picks, because those picks should be a little more of a higher percentage than 6th and 7th round guys. But acknowledging that you're not going to bat 1,000, you take that pick, you take that player who still has some shine left from the draft. Some other team that would have at least viewed him as a 5th-round pick or maybe a 4th-round pick, and they didn't get it. They just didn't have draft capital to get him there, and then you move them out. So I think it's smart. I don't think it's necessarily the franchise-altering maneuver, but all of this in the aggregate, all of this in the long term, looking at it in a big picture sense, you're collecting assets and you're collecting capital. And to your point, whether it's moving up for the guy in the 3rd round that you like next spring, or if it's a pick that you can include in a trade deadline scenario where you need a wide receiver, or you need an offensive lineman, or whatever. I mean, knowing that they're going to have injuries over the course of the year. They've already had injuries. Those are just assets that you have that can allow you to make your football team better. Whether you end up using them or not, having them in that holster makes it easier to build your roster in the long term.
Luke is here. You can find him out on the Twitter thing. You can usually find him out in Owens Mills or Luke at WNST.net. Baltimore Luke all along the way. You can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net. Big appreciation to all of our sponsors we head into the season. I'm wearing my Coons Ford shirt. Dennis will be here on Thursday getting ready for football as well as Sunday morning. And then, of course, getting you ready next week. Got a lot of college football going on this weekend. Luke, no golf tournaments this weekend. No crab cakes this weekend. No distractions. Just trying to get ready for football next week. Thoughts about other teams in the league and them getting ready? And this usually is a time where somebody else's Pernell McPhee gets cut and the Ravens can swoop in. As much as you talk about it's not a zero chance that they lose these guys. There's 2 or 3 of these guys on every other team that this is that 48-hour period where Eric DeCosta sniffs and George Kokina sniff pro personnel around the league as well. Any thought? I mean, the Cam Newton thing, right, was the newsmaker, and the vaccine thing is also going to be a newsmaker here this week. But every organization's going through this, and I think we talk a lot about the Ravens and where they are. We sort of snooze on the other 31 teams. I don't even know who's on the Raiders at this point, right? Like, I was thinking the other day, they played Detroit. Who the hell's their quarterback? Jared Goff? I mean, I'm thinking, like, who's where? And I think this is the week we sort of – and you gave me a hard time early in the thing saying some people watch all this. Yeah, and a lot of people don't. And my wife loves football. My wife has tickets, and there are people who are engaged with football bigly that haven't paid attention to preseason football in a long time, and they get into it. This is the week where fantasy teams are being picked, all of that kind of thing for the rest of the league. And I asked Dennis about this. Who do you expect to be good? I mean, everywhere I go, it's Browns, but I'm not sleeping on the Steelers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned, I wasn't really all that shocked that Cam Newton was released. I mean, put the vaccination stuff aside, which I'm not dismissing that. That's a big part of this.
Yeah, can you win 11 games with him as your quarterback right now?
Did anyone watch him play last year? He was bad. I mean, he just wasn't very good. And you drafted a quarterback in the first round. Look, I mean, the Ravens, when they drafted Lamar Jackson, everyone knew that Joe Flacco's time was short. I mean, even people that were kind of in denial about it. You don't draft a quarterback in the first round with the thought that, especially if you don't have the best quarterback in the league. I mean, maybe Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love and that whole weird saga, which you're seeing how that's playing out a year later.
The strangest thing about the kid is he was like never going to be Cordell Stewart. He was never going to line up out wide and play that game. And that was the weird part about it. Is they didn't bring him in as a piece. They brought him in as the piece.
Yeah. So I wasn't surprised with the Cam Newton thing. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, Urban Meyer just said the quiet part out loud, right? As far as acknowledging that vaccination status has a big part in roster, which, you're going to get the union barking at you about that. I mean, we know that's the case in any professional sport, any professional setting that has unions. I mean, they're going to protect their people. Whether they
and you know what Urban Meyer's going to do? Protect the guys on his roster so he can get on the field on Sunday.
Sure. Hey, what I'm saying is he just said the quiet part out loud.
I'm no Urban Meyer guy.
Right. I don't think anyone.
I'm wearing Ohio State red right now.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would. I think there are very few people out there that would actually disagree with his sentiment. It's just, dude, you can't say that in the same way that when guys are having personal issues and things of that nature that they think are impacting their job performance, you're not going to hear a coach or GM say that out loud either, right? I mean, you just can't. So there's that. But, as far as the rest of the league, I mean, I look at the AFC. I mean, Kansas City's still at the top until anyone proves otherwise. They're still the team to beat. Buffalo clearly proved themselves a little more than the Ravens did last year. And then after that, I mean, I look at the Ravens and the Browns on kind of different levels from the standpoint of, I'll even give you, I think the Browns, top to bottom, might have a better roster than the Ravens, but I trust the Ravens coaching staff more. I trust Lamar Jackson more than Baker Mayfield at this point, although Baker Mayfield played very well down the stretch last year. I think those are the two favorites in the AFC North. Pittsburgh, I'm with you to a degree. I'm not ready to write them off. However, I think it would be disingenuous to not look at the issues they had late last year and then acknowledge their quarterback's another year older and say at some
and
point in
not
time,
improving in the way Tom Brady did. Like,
yeah. I mean, yeah, right. Or Tom Brady feels like he's Benjamin Button, just aging backwards year after year after year, or something crazy. But that said, Pittsburgh still does have a good defense in the same way that I just mentioned John Harbaugh with an edge over Kevin Stefanski, who I think did a nice job with the Browns last year, but still the Browns. He's not John Harbaugh or Mike Tomlin. That's why I'm still not counting out Pittsburgh entirely. But if you're asking me to, look at it from a power ranking standpoint, the hierarchy in the AFC North, I think it's Ravens and Browns duking it out for the top. And I still give the slight edge to the Ravens, although J.K. Dobbins going down, lowers my confidence level a little bit there. And then, the Steelers and the Bengals, is Joe Burrow healthy? Can they protect Joe Burrow? I mean, I think he's got some nice weapons. I think that team can be improved, but I think they're still very, very clearly lacking.
Ravens better not lose to them this year. I mean, that's same thing with the Browns, and I think about that. But I looked at the schedule: Colts, Chargers. Some of these games, like, I don't know what to make of it. I want to think the Chargers are going to be okay because I think that kid can play. And I think so that makes them improved. The Raiders, I have no idea. I don't think Denver's going to be very good, right? So, I mean, this is the first 6 or 7 or 8 weeks of the season to say, all right, we know what the Chiefs are. We sort of know what the Browns are and what the Steelers represent later on. But what about these other teams who I can't imagine Detroit's going to be any good? I mean, I'm not W-N-L-ing, but I'm Wing and Elling. I'm looking at it and saying, where are the hiccups here? And what would we think about this team if they go to Detroit and lose in week 3? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
That's fair. And I remember when we talked about it, when the schedule came out, and what was it, early May, I think it was. I think you look at how this schedule plays out, you see how the back half of the schedule, how much of a bear it is in terms of AFC North games, in terms of some good teams coming to Baltimore, like the LA Rams on January 2nd for that week 17, which is no longer the last week of the season. Week 18 is the last week of the season.
They got to go play in Chicago in the cold in November, right?
The Packers come into town December 19th with presumably Aaron Rodgers, which back in May, we didn't know if that was going to be the case. So, and I mentioned that slate of AFC North games in starting in late November, going through the end of the season with the Steelers coming to Baltimore on January 9th for the regular season finale, which is still it's so weird trying to get used to the 17-game schedule. But my point is the back half of the schedule, when you go into your bye week, Halloween weekend, you better be in a position where you have no more than maybe 2 losses, because if you're struggling a little more than that early in the season, where, as you mentioned, at Las Vegas, home against KC, all right. The Chiefs, until the Ravens beat them, it's hard to view that game with a lot of confidence. At Detroit, at Denver, home against Indy, home against the Chargers. Okay, those 2 games, we'll see. Home against Cincinnati, then your bye week. If you have more than 2 losses with that slate of schedule, and then knowing what's in store for you after the bye week, I'll say this: you can forget about the number 1 seed or home field advantage. And I would also say, you're going to be in an absolute fight, probably with Cleveland and maybe Pittsburgh for the division. I think the Ravens need to make their hay early in the season and put themselves in a position where they're 7-1, 7-2 kind of territory midway through the season. And then hoping that you're healthy, hoping that your passing game has evolved, hoping that the running game without J.K. Dobbins has been fine, which I think it will be, assuming they don't lose Gus Edwards at this point. And we'll see if they bring in any other veterans, to your point about the waiver wire and players being available. But I really think this is a team that has to get off to a good start. And that's why when you do look at not just the Dobbins injury, but more so Marquise Brown missing virtually all of training camp, Sammy Watkins missing the last 2 weeks of training camp, Rashad Bateman missing the beginning of the season, that's where you do look at the passing game and say, okay, you know what? I think what they do, their typical offensive identity that they've had that's worked so well against just about everyone, other than the absolute best of the best in the league. I think their formula will be fine, but you better hope that passing game is firing on all cylinders, or at least more cylinders by the time they get to the second half of the schedule. And you hope you're able to take care of business early on because it's not going to get any easier in that way. So I still like the Ravens. I'm still very high on the Ravens, but all these wide receivers being hurt, the offensive line being in flux, although it does seem like the offensive line's starting to come together now. My expectation is Ben Powers begins the year at left guard. We'll see if Ben Cleveland unseats him at some point in the way Orlando Brown did James Hurst 3 years ago at right tackle. But just the wide receivers being absent, losing Dobbins, which just was so much upside for the running game, which was kind of crazy to think about it because they've run for all these yards over the last few years. But Dobbins was still an extra home run hitter that they're not going to have there. So it's going to come down to what we've talked about. What we've talked about for the better part of going on 3 years now. Can this passing game take a step forward, become a little more efficient, more explosive down the field, more effective passing outside the numbers? They don't have to be number one in the league. They don't have to be top 5 in the league. Can they move into that top 12, let's say, in terms of yards per attempt, in terms of efficiency, in terms of just being a little more explosive? They can do that, coupled with their running game and Lamar Jackson taking off with his legs and Gus Edwards, assuming he can handle a bigger workload, which I think he can.
I never thought he was a backup running back, by the way, Gus.
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, you can look at Gus and say, look, has he benefited from Lamar Jackson? Well, yeah, everyone else that's played for the Ravens has benefited from playing with Lamar Jackson. I mean, his threat to run put such stress on the defense, whether you're going to hand the ball off to someone else or throw it, that, yeah, you are going to benefit from that. But you look at his metrics in terms of yards after contact per attempt, in terms of what he does from a short yardage standpoint. He's gotten a little bit leaner, a little bit faster over the last couple of years than what he was as a rookie. I think Gus Edwards, look, I'm not going to sit here and say he's Nick Chubb or he's the best of the best in the league, but I don't see any reason why Gus Edwards can't handle, say, a Mark Ingram workload from 2 years ago, which I think was 203 carries or something like that, and be 1,000-yard back for them, and be a guy who's going to be really effective for them in a more of a leading role. The big question is going to be who else steps up. I mean, Tyson Williams looked good in the preseason. We'll see how that looks come September and October and November. Do they bring someone else in, or do they say, hey, Justice Hill, this is your time. We drafted you in the 4th round 2 years ago. It's time to go. You can be a third down complimentary back and catch some passes out of the backfield and help us in pass protection. If he can't, they're going to bring someone else in who they think can. So it's going to be interesting. But I think even with losing J.K. Dobbins and L.J. Fort, their inside linebacker depth taking a hit there, not as severe as the Dobbins injury in terms of impact, but this is still a team that has a lot going for it. A team that's won a lot of football games the last couple of years, and as disappointing as the Dobbins injury was, I still like this team as much as anyone in the AFC that's not named the Kansas City Chiefs. So it's a matter of going out and doing it and trying to stay healthy and trying to improve and grow and evolve as a football team. And we're going to see how that plays out. And to your point, with the schedule being what it is, as you get deeper into the season, they better start fast. They better stack some wins early on, and so they can keep themselves in that conversation for the division. And you hope that first round bye, which only the number 1 seed gets right now, keep in mind.
Chucky will have the Raiders ready to play next Monday night as we head out to Las Vegas. All things Ravens can be found out at Baltimore Positive. You can always find Luke at WNST.net, and Baltimore Luke as well as we get in. Have a great Labor Day weekend, Luke. Hang in there. We'll bring the cuts back, and we'll be ready for football on Tuesday morning, all right?
Absolutely. Encourage everyone to be on the Baltimore Positive text service sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. We'll have, whether it's notable practice squad signings, not guys you haven't heard of, but anyone notable on the practice squad, anyone that's brought back, anyone they might let go that you thought, hey, they're going to be on the roster, and then you find out, no, they're not. So
Cam Newton's available, and he's unvaccinated. That would fix the room.
If Cam Newton were vaccinated, you know what? I'd listen to that possibility of him as a backup. But I think Tyler Huntley had a really nice preseason. I think they feel good about him. But you are going to need a third quarterback if, for some reason, McSorley doesn't wind up on the practice squad.
I just like Cam Newton's Stone shirt when he came in here, that throwback when he came in for the Torrey Smith basketball game. All right, Nasty at WNST.net finds me. Big thanks to our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast. Chicken Palooza's over. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be eating chicken or Western fries or gassing up there. Of course, getting the coffee that Justin Tucker sings about at Royal Farms. Also, our friends at Wise. We had a great Wise conversation about the Crab Cake Tour on the 19th of September. We will be be at Wise Fullerton, that's store 206, right on Bel Air Road, just outside the Beltway, eating crab cakes, having signature crab cakes. And I might even be working on my own recipe. I'm going to talk to Rob Santoni about that at Wise Markets. Also, next Friday, we're kicking the season off with a Purple Friday. We're going to be at the Chaucer in Highland Town at 2 o'clock, kicking off the Maryland Crab Cake Tour, local style, with local people and local things. I'm making the invites now. We'll tell you more about it. Come on down, have a crab cake or the wings or the chicken tingo, or hell, just get a beer and look at the view down at the Chaucer. We'll be at Foster and Highland Avenue. That'll be happening at 2 o'clock next Friday. What is the date on that Friday? That's the 10th of September. I'm trying to get all my dates together because the Ravens play on the weird 13th because of the Monday, but the season starts on the 12th. So, and Luke's trying to get used to Week 17 games on January 9th. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I am Nestor. We are WNST. AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking. Baltimore positive, even with the governor of Maryland.